In this video, I'll be comparing the RF 35mm f1.8 lens to the Canon EF 50mm f1.8 lens. So the reason I'm comparing these two lenses is because the EF 50mm is the cheapest Canon EF mount lens, and the RF 35mm is the cheapest Canon RF mount lens. So these are both great beginner lenses, and they're both pretty much the most popular options for anyone that buys into the Canon EOS R series. So let's get right into it and compare these two budget Canon lenses. So the first thing to point out with these lenses is, yes, I said they're both budget lenses, but the RF lens is still 4 times the price of the EF lens. So even though they're both the cheapest in their own mounts, there's still quite a big price gap. And there's a few reasons for that, and I'll actually talk about that when I get into the pros and cons of each lens. First things first, let's get into some specs. Let me check my notes. Alright, close focus distance. So the RF 35mm lens is actually considered a macro lens, which means you can get really close up to subjects and still keep them in focus. Now the 50mm lens is not a macro lens, so that's the first big difference between these two lenses besides the focal length itself. So the closest focus distance on the 35mm is 6.69 inches, and on the 50mm it's 13.78 inches. So you can essentially get twice as close to any subject with the 35mm lens and still be able to keep it in focus. Now when I get into my testing portion of this video, I'm going to show some examples of the closest focus distance on both lenses to show you basically how close you can get with each lens while keeping your subject in focus still. I'll have examples of that later on in the video, but first things first, I'm going to go over the pros and cons of each of these lenses. So starting out with a 35mm f1.8 macro lens. Like I just stated, this lens does have macro capabilities, so you can get really close to a subject while keeping it in focus, which a lot of people, including myself, really like because I shoot a lot of B-roll and close-ups of cameras and stuff for my videos, so having the macro capability, being able to get really close up, is really neat. Also, the 35mm has a control ring. So this is something new to Canon's RF mount lenses, and they all have this control ring at the very end. So if it's a zoom lens, you'll have the zoom ring, the focus ring, like all lenses, but also right at the very end of the lens, there's a control ring. And that's really cool because you can actually map this ring to a bunch of different settings. So you can have it change things such as your ISO or your aperture or your shutter speed. So this basically adds more functionality to every lens rather than just focusing and zooming. And so that's great in the 35mm lens because my EOS RP only has 2 control dials, so I can change the shutter speed and the aperture. But in order to change the ISO, I either have to use a touch screen or go into the menu or whatever. But with this control ring on the 35mm lens, I can hook that right up to the ISO, so I can change all 3 things without having to go into the menu or touch the touchscreen at all. The second thing is the RF 35mm is for the RF mount, so you don't have to adapt it to mount it to the Canon EOS R, the RP, or any R mount cameras. So with the 50mm EF lens, you have to get the EF to RF adapter, and then mount the lens to the adapter, and then the adapter to the camera, which adds weight and length to the whole setup. And also the RF mount is the newest mount for Canon. It's what they're moving into for the future. So the RF 35mm will be a lot more future-proof because basically all Canon cameras in the future are going to move to the RF mount. Also, the RF 35mm has really great build quality. It's not an L lens, so it's not Canon's superior, super high-class lenses, but it feels really solid and well-built while you're holding it, which is fantastic. Now, it doesn't have any sort of weather sealing, but neither does the EF 50mm lens, because again, they're not L lenses, they're not Canon's high-class, high-end lenses. They're both the cheapest lenses in their own lineup. Alright, also the last thing, the RF lens has image stabilization, which the 50mm EF lens does not. So, that's it with the RF 35mm lens, all the pros of that lens. Let's move on to the 50mm lens, because it does have some pros over the 35mm. First things first is it's way cheaper. The 50mm lens is 4 times cheaper than the RF lens. So if you're on a budget, the 50mm lens is the way to go. It's like $100. You can get it used for like 80 bucks, and it's fantastic. It's nice and sharp. It's f1.8, so it's really good in low light. So if you're on a really tight, like $100 budget, you really can't go wrong with the 50mm lens. And also, since it is a tighter focal length, you're gonna have better background separation because both being at f1.8, the longer focal length is always gonna have better background separation just because of the more compression. And I'm not gonna go too deep into the whole statistics and stuff, but 50mm lens will have better background separation from your subject, which will be great for portraits or anything like that. So there's the pros and cons of each one of these lenses compared to each other, but specs aren't everything. The actual image quality itself is more important. So let's get right into some example pictures and videos, some autofocus tests, stuff like that. With these lenses, I'm gonna show you all that, and then I'll get into the final verdict of which one I'd recommend. Alright, so to wrap things up with this comparison, here's what I would recommend doing. So if you have a higher budget and you're interested in shooting macros and close-ups of things, definitely get the 35mm RF lens. This is a great all-around focal length. You can do macro stuff, you can do portraits, street photography, anything like that. It's a great focal length to get started with. And again, it's just the cheapest RF mount lens, so you really can't go wrong with it. It's really sharp, and it's just a fantastic lens. But if you plan on shooting portraits and people, I would go with the 50mm. It's a great portrait lens, but either way, it's completely up to you. Look over those pictures, watch some more reviews, and pretty much choose whatever one has the best features for you. But as a quick alternative, I would recommend, if you're gonna shoot portraits and pictures of people, you can pick up the EF 50mm f1.8 and the EF 85mm f1.8 for the same price as the RF lens together. And so these are two fantastic portrait lenses. I definitely check out some reviews of both of them and some examples. But I think if you want to shoot portraits, you could buy both of those and have two lenses for the price of the RF 35mm lens. And they're gonna be a lot better for portraits with really good separation, creamy bokeh, all that stuff people like. So definitely check out those two lenses if you're interested in shooting portraits. But again, the best all-around lens, I'd go with the RF lens. It's newer, it's a little sharper, it has the control ring, it has image stabilization, macro capabilities, and it's all around a better lens. So if it's a complete toss-up, you have enough money for both, you just don't know, just go with the 35mm. It's gonna be a fantastic lens and really future-proof with the RF line of cameras. So that wraps up this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.